Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the show where we try to step back from the day-to-day and really look at some of the biggest ideas in theology and history. I'm your host, and today we're doing a deep dive that looks at history in a pretty remarkable way. Not as a series of random, sort of disconnected events, but as one single, carefully constructed story. A story that points directly to one person. We're trying to see the blueprint behind it all, the necessary design.
And for that, we're turning to Jonathan Edwards. A giant, to say the least. Our source today is his incredible work, A History of the Work of Redemption. This was his attempt to chart God's design through all of history, right from the very beginning. We're looking at his thoughts on that first major period, everything from the fall of man right up to the birth of Christ. And his main idea is, well, it's pretty straightforward. He argues that every major historical shift, every prophecy, even the day-to-day civil transactions of this one tiny nation, they were all arranged by God to point history directly at Jesus Christ.
So, for you listening, what's our mission today? What are we hoping you'll walk away with from this classical Reformed view?
The mission is to really grasp the coherence of the entire Old Testament as Edwards saw it, its historical necessity. We're going to unpack 8 key remarks he makes. These remarks are his argument for why the whole course of divine providence, starting right after the fall, actually proves the truth of Christianity. And, just as important, how this grand narrative structure establishes the divine authority of the Old Testament itself. We're looking for the architecture, you could say.
Okay, let's jump right into that main claim then. Edwards really doesn't pull any punches. He says Christ is the absolute predetermined center of all history. He kicks it off with this almost mechanical analogy for how time flows.
He does, and it's such a powerful way to visualize it. He says that if you look at the course of things from the beginning of the world, all the big movements, what he calls the great dispensations of divine providence. And a dispensation is just, a major era or a specific way God governs the world, like the time of the patriarchs or the era of the law. Edwards says if you just trace those historical lines accurately across time, you'll find that all of them, every single one, centers in Jesus of Nazareth. They converge.
So it's not like they just happen to run in the same direction. They're all being pulled toward a single point. That implies a really meticulous, non-random process. He's not just talking about some vague spiritual theme here. He's talking about literal history, actual prophecies, all structured like a roadmap.
Exactly. For Edwards, all the great acts of providence, whether they were aimed at the Jews, who were, meant to preserve the covenant, or at the Gentiles, whose empires rose and fell, all of it, right down to the moment Christ was born, was explicitly pointing to him, declaring who he was and why he was needed.
It's a cumulative case, then.
It is. He sees the evidence as so plain, so obvious, that this specific man, the one born in Bethlehem who lived in Nazareth and Capernaum and was crucified in Jerusalem, that he must be the great Messiah. For him to look at that evidence and deny it isn't just a difference of opinion. It's a failure to follow the data to its only logical conclusion.
But of course, that immediately brings up the big objection, the one every skeptic raises. Maybe some clever people just, contrived the whole thing. Maybe they retrofitted the history and the prophecies to make it look like everything points to Jesus. How does Edwards handle that charge?
He has a really powerful reply, and it's rooted in just basic historical logistics. Common sense, really.
Yeah.
He asks, how could cunning men have possibly contrived things that point to Jesus centuries before he was even born? We aren't talking about vague predictions. We're talking about specific places, names, family lines, the very nature of his death, the kind of kingdom he'd have. The level of detail just overwhelming.
The coordination alone to keep that story straight over thousands of years would be impossible for any group of people to manage. I mean, think about the instability of that part of the world. How could human cleverness let them foresee and point to events that were still ages and ages away?
The time frame. That's the real killer for the skeptic's argument. And Edwards grounds his whole response in one simple, undeniable historical fact. The Jewish people themselves had these Old Testament writings with all these specific prophecies long before Jesus was born. That fact is the ultimate historical firewall.
Okay, let's pause on that, because that really is the linchpin of his whole historical defense. If you were a critic in the 18th century, you might think, well, maybe the early Christians just messed with the scrolls. Why does the fact that the Jews had them make that impossible?
Because the Jews were, and still are, the rivals of Christianity when it comes to Jesus being the Messiah. Edwards points out that the Jewish people, everywhere they were scattered in the world, held these writings in the highest veneration. They were the sacred oracles of God to them. They would never, ever have accepted these books from Christians, especially not as proof that Jesus was the Messiah, because that's the very thing they denied. If the books were a Christian forgery, the entire Jewish community would have immediately called them out as fraudulent. They never would have confirmed, yes, these are the exact same books we've had for centuries.
So the fact that a non-Christian community, a community that completely rejected the Christian conclusion, preserved and venerated the Old Testament, serves as the ultimate proof against the idea of forgery. It proves the prophecies came before the events.
It proves their origin had to be divine. Which leads right into his second major point. The argument from admirable harmony, the internal coherence of it all. Think about it. The Old Testament was written by dozens of different people, kings, shepherds, prophets, priests, over huge, distant periods of time. They were separated by culture, geography, everything.
And this incredible agreement, despite all that diversity, is what Edwards points to as proof of its divine authority. All these parts, written centuries apart, harmonize on one single event, the coming of Christ. An event that, as he says, no single human author could have possibly known without divine revelation.
Just think about how improbable that is. If the Old Testament wasn't inspired, then this central idea of a coming Messiah, his specific family line, where he'd be born, the timing, the nature of his sacrifice, all of that would have been, in his words, a mere figment of their own brain, just a cultural myth.
And if it was just some vain imagination, how did it actually happen? How did that same figment come true, fulfilling all those details so exactly?
And even more amazing, how did all those different authors, Moses, 1,400 years before Christ, David, 1,000 years before, Malachi, 400 years before, how did they all agree so precisely on the same figment? They never met. They lived under completely different political systems, and yet their stories all converge perfectly around the same future person.
That is the ultimate group project challenge, isn't it? We can't get a small team in an office to agree on a single plan, let alone this.
Right. This unity of purpose among such different people across more than 1,000 years, all pointing to the same future event. Edwards sees that as clear and certain evidence. The internal consistency of the Bible is its own defense against the charge that it's just a human invention.
This brings us to a really common objection, one you still hear all the time. Edwards tackles what a lot of people see as a major problem. The idea that the Old Testament can't be God's word because it's just so full of, civil history, lists of kings, records of wars, government changes. It looks just like the records of any other ancient nation, like Egypt or Babylon. Why would God's word be so clogged up with that kind of stuff?
And that objection treats the historical parts of the Old Testament like they're just a local chronicle, no different from the annals of Rome or something. But Edwards says, no, the case of the Old Testament histories is fundamentally completely different from all others.
Okay, so what sets it apart? What's the first major difference?
First, just the scope of its coverage is unique. This history, and this history alone, gives an account of the origin of everything, the creation itself. And second, it's the only history that traces a single connected story from that origin point all the way to the end of time. It gives you this idea of a grand overarching plan of divine providence. No other human history even tries to do that.
So it's the difference between, say, a history of a single battle versus a universal history of God's entire redemptive plan for humanity. It provides the context for our whole existence.
Precisely. The Old Testament gives you a view of the whole series of big events in providence, from the very beginning to the final consummation of all things. It shows you this glorious account of the wise and holy designs of the Supreme Governor, showing that nothing is random. Everything is connected to a final goal.
And a huge part of this is who the authors were. They weren't just court scribes writing things down.
That's a critical point. Edwards reminds us that the writers of this history came with clear signs and testimonies that they were prophets, directly inspired by God. This isn't just a human record of events. This is God's divinely guided revelation of his own actions in the world.
So if you accept that premise, that the authors are inspired, then objecting to a book being divine just because it contains history is, as Edwards calls it, a poor fancy.
The real misunderstanding is forgetting the purpose of that history. These historical accounts contain the great events through which God carries on his work of redemption from one age to the next. So they are just as full of divine instruction and elements that reveal Christ and the gospel as the parts of Scripture that are purely prophetic or poetic. The history is the vehicle for the theology.
If the work of redemption is the ultimate goal, then the history that shows the steps of that plan is the divine instruction. He uses a really simple but effective analogy about government records to make this point.
He does. He argues that if plain reason, the light of nature, teaches every civilized nation to keep records of their government and their administrations, How much more should we expect that God would give the world a record of his dispensations? If the affairs of a small kingdom are worth recording, surely God's actions are.
That's compelling logic, just based on comparative value. If a wise earthly king makes sure a history of his reign is written, why would we think it's unbelievable that Jesus Christ would make sure his church, which Edward sees as Christ's own nation, has a certain infallible history of his rule over them? The history of Israel is the divinely ordered royal chronicle of the King of Glory.
And think about what would happen if we didn't have it. The absence of this history would be devastating. Without the Old Testament, we'd be completely ignorant of how God has dealt with mankind from the beginning. We'd know nothing of creation, nothing of the fall of man, nothing about how God first set up a church, or how the light of the gospel even began to dawn.
We wouldn't know the reason God started going about this building, the church. We wouldn't know how the foundation was laid. And the time periods the Old Testament covers are so ancient, they're basically not recorded in any other reliable history on earth. If God hadn't given us this account, we'd be flying completely blind about the origin of his greatest work.
And here's where Edwards introduces this incredible theological scale. He says that people who object to the historical parts of the Old Testament might as well object to Moses' account of creation. Why? Because in the historical parts of the Old Testament, we have the history of a work that is no less important than creation, the work of redemption. In fact, he argues, the work of redemption is the greatest of all of God's works of providence.
Wait, hold on. I need to stop there. For someone like Edwards, coming from a classical Reformed background, that is a massive theological claim. Why is the work of redemption the greatest of God's works, greater even than the act of creation itself?
Because creation shows God's power and his wisdom in making something from nothing, which is incredible, obviously. But redemption shows his power plus his justice, his mercy, his holiness, and his patience, all of these attributes working together in perfect harmony to save a fallen, rebellious creature through the greatest possible sacrifice. Creation was a single act of command. Redemption required thousands of years of purposeful interaction, suffering, covenant, and finally, the incarnation and death of his own Son. The moral character required for redemption makes it a higher display of God's complete glory.
That really sets the scale, doesn't it? If redemption is God's masterpiece, then it absolutely demands a divinely inspired, detailed history. So Edwards is challenging the skeptic. What part of this Old Testament history could you possibly remove without breaking that thread, the series of events that carries this glorious work forward? And for him, the answer is you can't remove any of it.
And that leads us straight into his fourth major remark, where he really details the wisdom of God in how the Old Testament was put together. This is where he argues for the specific, functional necessity of every single book and every historical section.
So this isn't just about it being useful, it's about it being coherent. Every book has an irreplaceable job to do in advancing the redemptive plan. So let's start at the beginning, Genesis.
Well, you have to have an account of creation, of our first parents' original state, the fall, the world's decline after that, the flood, the origin of nations. It's absolutely necessary. Without that beginning, you don't understand the disease sin. And if you don't understand the disease, you can't possibly understand the necessity or the nature of the cure redemption.
And after establishing the problem, the solution needed a specific container, a specific vessel. So it was necessary to have an account of the church's succession, which meant focusing on Abraham and his family. But why that one nation, Israel?
2 reasons. First, to preserve true worship and true religion in a world that was just sinking into polytheism and corruption, to hold the line until the Savior came. But Edwards stresses that Israel wasn't just a container. The nation itself was typical.
Okay, that's a key term. What exactly does Edwards mean when he calls Israel the typical nation?
He means that the whole nation, its religious structure, its history, its leaders, its laws, it was all designed to be a prefigurement of Christ. They were types or shadows of the greater realities that would come with the gospel. They were designed to foreshadow, under what he calls a veil, a sort of covering or an obscured view, all the future glories of the gospel.
So the law isn't just a list of rules, it's a living prophecy. The sacrifices, the priesthood, even the geography of the promised land, it was all pointing forward.
Exactly. And because of that, the detailed accounts of Abraham's call, the slavery in Egypt, the dramatic journey to Canaan, and the forming of their civil and religious state, including the specific law and the typical worship, all of it was necessary. These weren't side stories. They were the essential scaffolding designed to communicate gospel truth through physical objects and historical events.
Okay, so after that foundation is laid, the history has to then focus on the moments in Israel's story that were, as he says, fullest of gospel mystery. So which figures and events really required the most attention?
He points right to the need for an account of the external glory under David and Solomon. David, in particular, needed a lot of detail because his personal story is just so full of the gospel. David established the throne, he embodied the idea of the righteous king, he suffered unjustly, and he was the source of so much prophetic material in the Psalms. His kingship itself was a type of Christ's eternal kingship.
And the significance of Solomon's reign usually boils down to one big building project.
Yes, building the temple was necessary because the temple itself was full of gospel mystery. The structure, the Holy of Holies, the veil, the sacrifices, every single part of it prefigured Christ as the ultimate place where God dwells and as the ultimate sacrifice that tears the veil. If we didn't have the history of the temple being built and dedicated, we lose the physical context for understanding Christ's own words about destroying and rebuilding the temple in 3 days.
Then the history has to cover the decline, the kingdom splitting, the captivity, the succession of kings until Babylon, their return.
This doesn't sound very glorious, but he says it's essential.
It's essential because it shows why God's direct intervention was necessary. The history of failure proves that the human means of preservation, the kings, the earthly temple, they couldn't hold up on their own. It sets the stage for the Messiah to arrive not just as another political king, but as a divine redeemer who was needed to fix a total spiritual collapse.
And this is where Edwards makes a fascinating point about the length of the text. Why are some periods covered in so much detail, while others get just a quick summary? Edwards notes that the Old Testament history is very detailed and long, where the work of redemption required it to be Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon. Those are key moments for the covenant or high points of typology. But the history gets much shorter where there was less direct emphasis on that work. For instance, the long period in Egypt, the time of the judges, or the reigns after Solomon that were less spiritually significant.
So it suggests the authors weren't trying to be comprehensive in a modern historical sense. They were being theologically purposeful. The length of the story is dictated by the significance of the redemptive event happening in that period.
It speaks to a kind of divine economy, you could say. And once that inspired history was finished after the return from exile, you needed a number of prophets to bridge that gap to the New Testament.
And their job was what, exactly?
Their main job was to foretell the coming of the Son of God and to detail the nature and glory of his kingdom in clearer and clearer terms. They were like harbingers to make way for him, getting the people ready, building that expectation. And their prophecies had to be collected and kept in the church to make sure the preparation was continuous right up to the moment Christ was born.
Okay, let's move past the history and prophecy to the wisdom literature. Edward says the Psalms were necessary.
Absolutely necessary. You need a book of divine songs that represents the true spirit of devotion that Christ's followers ought to have. The Psalms give you the raw, inner emotional life of a believer in the Old Covenant. The faith, hope, love, joy, resignation, humility, repentance, all the essential parts of a relationship with God. They teach us how to pray and how to feel toward God.
Then you have Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Why these specific kinds of books?
These were needed to provide books of moral instruction for human life, rules of true wisdom and prudence for how to conduct yourself in all kinds of circumstances. They established the ethical framework, the wisdom tradition that the gospel would later build on. They teach you how to live justly in the world while you're waiting for the Messiah.
And the book that often causes the most confusion for people, the Song of Solomon, a book of very intense poetic love poetry. Why is that essential to the story of redemption?
It's essential to represent the great love between Christ and his spouse, the church. It's adapted to the holy affections of a Christian soul, and it expresses that relationship using the highest human analogy we have, marriage and passionate love. It gives us the language for spiritual intimacy and devotion that goes beyond just ritual. It ensures the believer understands that a relationship with God is deeply personal.
And finally, he brings up the book of Job, which often feels like it stands alone, dealing with suffering and divine justice. Why is Job so critical to the structure of the Old Testament?
Job is crucial for teaching you how to conduct yourself when you're under affliction. Edward sees the whole church as being in a militant state, always at war with sin, and entering heaven through much tribulation. So you need a divinely inspired, detailed example of suffering, debate, endurance, and final vindication. It normalizes suffering. Edwards even points out that Job was probably first given to the church while they were suffering in Egypt, and that the Apostle James uses Job specifically to comfort Christians under persecution.
So Job not only deals with the problem of suffering, but it also gives us a glimpse of the ancient theology before the law was given at Sinai. Edward's conclusion is pretty definitive then. Every single part of the Old Testament is useful and necessary, and you can't get rid of any of it without causing a huge loss to the church and breaking that narrative thread of redemption.
And that takes us to section 4, where Edwards starts to pull it all together. He affirms the one great subject of the entire Bible, and then argues for why the Old Testament is so useful for believers today.
He says that Christ and his redemption are the great subject of the whole Bible. Everything else is subordinate to that. The prophecies, the songs, the moral rules, they're all given in subordination to him. Even the very beginning, the history of creation, is just an introduction, just setting the stage for the history of redemption which follows immediately after.
The whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, is filled with the gospel. The only difference between them is one of clarity or visibility. The Old Testament contains the gospel under a veil. It's seen through shadows, types, veiled historical events. But the New Testament contains it unveiled, so we can see the glory of the Lord with open face. The content is the same great truth, just the illumination has gotten brighter.
And this view is so important for pushing back against that common idea that the Old Testament is out of date or that Christians don't really need it much anymore. Edwards calls that a very great mistake, and he says it comes from not observing the Old Testament's true nature and design.
Right. If you see the grand redemptive design, the Old Testament suddenly appears full of the gospel of Christ, and it perfectly illustrates and confirms the doctrines and promises of the New Testament. It gives you the essential context, the historical depth, and the prophetic confirmation for what the New Testament reveals plainly.
And here's where the real challenge is for the reader. Edwards argues that even the parts we tend to see as having the least divine instruction, the dry historical lists, the genealogies, the specific measurements for the tabernacle, he says those are actually mines and treasures of gospel knowledge.
And the reason we think those parts have so little in them is simple. We read them superficially. We only look at the top of the ground and pass a quick judgment. We never bother to dig into the mine where we'd find it stored with what is more valuable than silver and gold. The fault isn't with the text, it's with our casual approach to it.
Can you give us a concrete example of that? Let's say a listener opens up 1 Chronicles and they're hit with this long list of obscure names in a genealogy. What gospel treasure is Edwards telling us to dig for there?
That's a great question, because that's the perfect example of superficial reading. We see those genealogies, and our first instinct is to skip them because they don't seem like moral lessons. But Edwards would say that genealogy is the proof of the covenant's continuity. Every single name on that list, no matter how obscure, is a historical peg that holds up the covenant line leading to David and then eventually to Christ. The whole purpose of that list is to assure you that God's covenant promise of a Messiah was preserved through all those messy human generations, providing the legal and historical right for Jesus to claim the title Son of David. The gold isn't the names themselves, it's the infallible preservation of the line.
So we're not mining for biographical details, we're mining for confirmation of the covenant, which is the engine of redemption. That totally shifts the focus.
It does. And this view should change how we see the whole Bible as this precious treasure. Edwards reflects on how little we consider the privilege we have, just possessing the Bible, that we can converse with it whenever we want, having access to the mind of God in human language.
It's a book that goes so far beyond any human writing. It reveals God to us. It gives us a view of this grand design, this glorious scheme of providence from the beginning, in either history or prophecy. It reveals the great Redeemer, his redemption, and all the steps God took to accomplish it from the first stone to the last.
We might prize a history that gives us a clear account of some great earthly prince, like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. We'll spend hours studying their tactics and politics. But Edwards asks, shouldn't we prize the history that God gives us of the glorious kingdom of his Son, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, and what he did for the redemption of his chosen people? The comparative value is infinite. We should pay more attention to the history of the one who governs all things than to the histories of those he governs.
And that comparison of values leads right to this really crucial point of application, the challenge of reading inattentively. If the Bible is this incredible treasure, why do so many of us miss it, treating gold like it's common stone?
Edwards puts the blame right on the reader's inattentive, unobservant way of reading the scriptures. The Bible is the most comprehensive book in the world, covering time and eternity. But that's useless if we don't observe what he calls the drift of the Holy Ghost in it. We have the map of God's plan, but we refuse to read the key.
That lack of focus means we have to actively look for the meaning, not just wait for it to jump off the page. The psalmist prayed to God, "Enlighten my eyes that I might behold wondrous things out of your law." Edwards says the scriptures are full of wondrous things, but you need that divine help and that focused attention to actually see them.
And he points to a specific failure that we're still guilty of today. People read the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Ruth, David, and so on, as if they were just the private concerns of these particular people, just interesting biographies. We personalize the story without connecting it to the much larger divine plan that's there to serve.
We tend to focus on David and Goliath as just a nice story about an underdog winning, or Joseph's rise to power as a tale about perseverance.
But these seemingly private concerns are accounts of vastly greater things, with much bigger and more extensive significance than we usually realize. Joseph being elevated to power isn't just about him. It's the mechanism God uses to make sure the covenant line survives a famine. David becoming king is about establishing the eternal throne. The infinitely great things in these histories are just passed over without a thought, read as if they were written just to entertain men's fancies or give a moral lesson to kids.
If the entire history of David is subservient to establishing the line of the King of Glory, then yeah, reading it as just a good adventure story is to miss the entire point. It makes me wonder how many times I've read Genesis 5 and just skipped the genealogy, essentially treating pure gold as common stone, like you said.
And that analogy of neglect is so powerful. Edwards uses two very relatable parables to describe this common spiritual state.
The first one is about the treasure itself.
A person who has a Bible but doesn't observe what's in it is like a man who has a box full of silver and gold but doesn't know it. He thinks it's just common stones. He's never any better off for having the treasure. He might as well not have it at all, because his ignorance completely nullifies his possession of it.
And the second one is about its use.
A person who has plenty of the best food stored up in his house, nourishing, life-giving food, but doesn't know it's there, will never taste it. And he's just as likely to starve as if his house were empty. The usefulness of the Bible is completely dependent on the reader's focused attention and observation.
So what's the key practical step Edwards would want us to take? Is it just rereading, or is there a specific interpretive lens we need to put on when we approach these historical books?
Edwards demands the interpretive lens of Christological necessity. The practical step is this. Stop asking, what does this story teach me about being a better person? And start asking, how is this historical event, this person, or this law necessary for the existence, the identity, or the work of the coming Messiah? When you ask that question, the genealogies become crucial. The civil wars become tests of the covenant. The ritual laws become shadows of Christ's perfection. It means reading every single page as part of the one unified story of redemption.
And that brings us to Edwards' final soaring conclusion, which uses this entire sweep of history we've been talking about as the ultimate measure of Christ's status. It's an argument of just staggering scale.
It really is the ultimate so what of the whole thing, bringing this 4,000-year plan into sharp focus. What all of this shows is how great a person Jesus Christ is, and how great his mission into the world must have been, given that so much was done by divine command just to prepare the way for his coming.
And how much preparation are we talking about? Exactly. Edwards says God spent 4,000 years getting the world ready for him, starting right after creation and the fall.
From age to age, God was accomplishing wonders, bringing mighty events to pass. He often had to overturn entire world powers, these massive empires and ancient cultures, just to maintain the necessary family line and make sure the prophecies were set up correctly. This shows you the necessity and the sheer scale of the redemptive act. It was not a quick fix.
The scale of God's attention is truly staggering when you frame it like that. The state of all mankind, all the revolutions, all the changes in the world were ordered to be subservient to this one great design, from generation to generation. Nations rose and fell not by accident, but according to the timeline needed for the Messiah's arrival.
Edwards uses this powerful, easy-to-understand analogy to get across the weight of this fact. Imagine you see these vast preparations being made for a stranger who's coming to a country. You see lots of people employed, huge public works being done, the affairs of the entire country being rearranged just for the entertainment of this one person. You would naturally conclude he must be an extraordinary person on very great business.
So if that's true for an earthly visitor, just consider the person for whom the great God of heaven and earth, the governor of all things, spent 4,000 years preparing the way. Surely this must be some great and extraordinary person, and it must be a great work indeed that he's coming to do. The preparation is the measure of the person.
He brings it right back to a local, immediate example of preparation. the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When the crowds threw down branches and spread their cloaks on the road, the whole city was moved, and they cried out, "Who is this?" And that was just because of the immediate local preparation they saw happening on the road for an hour or so.
But Edwards argues that when you consider the great things done in all ages, the covenants with Abraham, the parting of the Red Sea, the rise and fall of Babylon and Persia, all of it done to prepare the way for Christ, we should be crying out with so much more intensity, "Who is this? What great person is this?"
It leads you right to that question from Psalm 24. Who is this King of glory? The 4,000 years of history are the ultimate evidence of the glory and necessity of the Son of God. God showed this vast honor and respect to this person, confirming he is greatly beloved of him and sent on a grand errand. The entire Old Testament is a 4,000-year drum roll for the birth of the Redeemer.
What a compelling way to structure history. Edwards moves the Old Testament from what can feel like a fragmented collection of ancient books to one single coherent story. We started by seeing how the internal harmony of the Old Testament is evidence for its divine authority, with all of history's lines converging on Christ. Then we saw how he defends the civil and warlike histories, arguing they're necessary records of Christ's rule over his people, and that redemption is an even greater work than creation.
We detail the necessity of every single book, from the typological structure of the law, the moral wisdom of Proverbs, the devotion in the Psalms, and the example of suffering, and Job showing that you can't spare any part of the Old Testament without a loss. We ended by using those 4,000 years of global preparation as the ultimate measure of Christ's magnitude. This knowledge really demands that we approach the Bible not as a collection of stories, but as a detailed map of God's one singular consistent plan.
So if God spent 4,000 years orchestrating world history, the rise and fall of nations, the survival of one specific people, the timing of prophecies, all to prepare for one single event, consider the thoroughness of his continuing work in every detail of your own life now that Christ has come. Think about the precision he brings to his present dealings with you, having already completed the greatest work of all.